Rain poured outside an old, deserted warehouse, while a silver-haired man with a white streak yelled at his senpai, Tsuyoshi. His voice was full of anger as he demanded to know if Tsuyoshi even realized what he was doing. He pointed to the thing in Tsuyoshi's hands and asked if he understood what it really was. Then he warned him, if Tsuyoshi didn't kill it, he'd regret it later. But Tsuyoshi just apologized to the man, Samidare. Even with the warning, he had already made up his mind and believed his choice was the right one. After that, the story shifts to the past, back when the main character was still a little kid. He remembers how much he used to love superheroes. That was long ago, and only now does his current self think about it again. He doesn't know why the memory only came back at this moment. Reaching out to that memory, he apologizes to his younger self. His life and appearance now are so terrifying that he looks more like a demon, standing among blood-soaked guns. In his own words, he's the type of person superheroes would try to take down. Jumping back to the present, the scene opens in a liquor store. From there, we move to a teenage boy's bedroom covered with different kinds of guns displayed on the wall. This boy is Ichinose Shiki, the protagonist and the narrator from earlier. He's lounging in his room, talking on the phone. His way of speaking is rough and rebellious, and he even brags to the person on the other end that he got kicked out of school. Shiki told the person on the phone to stop apologizing about the fight at school, pointing out that everyone involved had been mad at him anyway. He even apologized himself, saying he shouldn't have jumped in since the guy could have handled it alone. Then, out of nowhere, Shiki ended the call. He got annoyed, or maybe just bored, and didn't feel like talking anymore. After hanging up, he sat there thinking about what happened. He kept trying to act like getting expelled didn't bother him, but inside he was frustrated and disappointed in himself. He didn't want to admit it, even in his own head. Right then, his adoptive father stormed into the room and smacked him without warning, yelling at him for being stupid enough to get kicked out of school. Shiki stared at him in shock, demanding to know why he just punched him like that. This man was Ichinose Tsuyoshi, the same person shown earlier rescuing a baby. He had raised that child as his own, and now he wanted answers. As a parent, he asked Shiki why he got expelled. Shiki snapped back and told him to shut up because it didn't matter. That only made Tsuyoshi angrier. He walked over and hit him again, shouting, "What kind of son tells his father, 'Shut up, idiot?'" Shiki complained that he didn't even call him an idiot. He slumped back into his chair, while Tsuyoshi calmed down a little and looked around the room. He asked why Shiki had so many guns when their family business was selling liquor, not weapons. Shiki just told him to shut up again and said he was going to do whatever he wanted. Shiki shot back by mocking his dad for barely making any sales lately. That hit a nerve. Tsuyoshi snapped and told him to shut it, saying he had no right to judge how an adult runs his business. Shiki smirked and said he didn't plan on growing up to be like him anyway. Instead of exploding, Tsuyoshi fired back sarcastically, pointing out how funny it was to hear that from a teenager who just got expelled. Annoyed, Shiki tried to think of a comeback. The only thing he came up with was, at least they weren't related by blood. Tsuyoshi didn't yell or look hurt, but he sighed and said, "Come on," knowing that was a cheap shot. Shiki knew it too, but his pride wouldn't let him apologize. Tsuyoshi left the room with a frown to get the phone that had been ringing non-stop. Shiki stayed where he was, sulking. The regret he tried to bury earlier came creeping back, and now it weighed even heavier on him, making his expression dark and lonely. A moment later, we see Tsuyoshi sounding lively as he takes a beer delivery order over the phone. Then a sudden gunshot rings out from Shiki's room. A hole appears in the wall and bullets roll into the hallway. Tsuyoshi just stares at them for a second, then goes back to work while Shiki shuts himself in his room again. Shiki explains that he and Tsuyoshi aren't connected by blood. Tsuyoshi once told him he'd been found as a newborn abandoned in the trash. His father was also the one who named him Shiki. Not long after, a well-dressed man showed up outside their liquor shop, clearly there for some kind of business. He rang the doorbell, but Shiki didn't rush to answer. He sat there wishing that, when he was a baby, a wealthy family had taken him in instead. Eventually, the constant ringing annoyed him enough that he stomped over to the door. The moment he opened it to ask who was there, a sudden explosion went off right in front of him. The blast shattered the glass door and blew apart the shelves full of liquor bottles. Even with all that destruction, Shiki didn't panic or get hurt. He just stared and said, "Wow," more curious than scared about who caused it. Through the smoke and falling glass, the attacker finally stepped into view. The man looked rich, dressed sharp, and completely out of place in the wreckage. Meanwhile, Tsuyoshi, who had just left to make a delivery, immediately knew something was wrong and sped back. He hadn't gotten far, so he arrived fast, without even braking. He drove straight through what was left of the storefront, crashing the car into the attacker and pinning the man against the wall. Shiki was startled by how suddenly everything happened, though he still didn't look panicked. The front of the car was wrecked from the impact, and the fancy visitor was badly crushed. Tsuyoshi jumped out, yanked open the passenger door, and yelled at Shiki to get in. Still dazed, Shiki asked what his dad was doing, but Tsuyoshi didn't waste time explaining. He just dragged him into the car because Shiki was too slow to move. Tsuyoshi hit the gas and sped off, leaving the rich guy he'd just run over lying there. But even after the impact, the man's fingers twitched, hinting he was still alive and starting to recover. Tsuyoshi cursed under his breath as he drove the now-damaged car, wondering if they were going to have to run off to another country. Shiki asked if the guy was some kind of loan shark and said killing one wouldn't fix anything. Tsuyoshi replied that Shiki was wrong. The man wasn't dead. Shiki argued there was no way anyone could survive getting crushed by a speeding car. Getting fed up, Tsuyoshi said they were out of time, so Shiki needed to shut up and listen because he was only explaining once. Shiki still didn't get what his dad was talking about and told him to just focus on driving. But Tsuyoshi dropped a shocking truth. He said Shiki had Oni blood in his body, and the man they ran over carried the blood of Momotaro. Shiki rubbed his head in frustration, calling it nonsense. Tsuyoshi tried to explain more, saying he knew it sounded crazy, but before he could continue, the rich man suddenly landed on top of the car. He stabbed down through the roof with a cleaver, causing the vehicle to explode. Tsuyoshi lost control, and the car crashed into an abandoned warehouse. Despite the wreck, both father and son made it out in one piece. Shiki, still trying to make sense of everything, asked his dad what they were supposed to do now. Suddenly, dark particles appeared in the air around Shiki. In just a second, they wrapped around him like a giant spiderweb. He couldn't move at all. The ropes made of those floating shadows held him tight. Tsuyoshi shouted his name, helpless to do anything as his son was trapped. The rich man stepped inside. Even with the dark ropes covering part of his face, Shiki could still talk. He wasn't exactly scared, but he was impressed that his dad was right. The guy really was still alive. The man glared at him and said that people with Oni blood, like Shiki, were nothing but pests to humanity. He pushed his long coat aside, and more dark particles flowed from his fingertips, moving exactly how he wanted. He said wiping out these pests was the mission of the Momotaro Corporation. His name was Momoya Samidare, a member of the Mumaru Corporation. He was the same guy from the very beginning of the story who tried to stop Tsuyoshi from taking baby Shiki. Shiki was stunned when he realized the man was actually a Momotaro. Tsuyoshi then told him that the old Momotaro legend wasn't a fairy tale. It was real. In Japan, almost every kid grows up hearing that story, but most think it's just folklore. Tsuyoshi explained that for over 1,000 years, the Momotaro and the Oni had been at war. Both sides left behind generations of descendants. Over time, the Momotaro organized themselves and eventually formed the Momotaro Corporation. The Oni, on the other hand, stayed scattered and divided. Because of that, the Momotaro always had the advantage in numbers whenever they fought the Oni. Because of that long war, the Oni became terrified of the Momotaro Corporation and started hiding among normal people to survive. While dangling in the web of dark particles, Shiki could only think, "What the heck is my dad even talking about?" His father told him to stay still, even though Shiki literally couldn't move an inch. Tsuyoshi said he'd handle Samidare himself, calling it a fight meant for adults. He rolled his shoulders, cracked his fingers, and got ready. Samidare shaped the floating particles into a sword, and the two men stared each other down. Shiki muttered that his dad didn't even know how to fight. But then, Tsuyoshi pulled out a cleaver and rushed straight at Samidare. In response, Samidare formed a dual-bladed weapon and blocked the attack. They started trading blows, their blades clashing again and again. Both of them were fast, matching each other's movements and deflecting every strike. After a moment, Samidare stepped back to catch his breath and explain. The dark particles he controlled were called Black Mist, a power only the Mumaru possessed. He seemed about to comment on Tsuyoshi's moves when he said something that made Shiki's eyes go wide. Samidare greeted Tsuyoshi like an old acquaintance, saying they'd both aged. Then he called him by a different last name, Momogawara, and revealed that Tsuyoshi used to be a member of the Momotaro Corporation and was actually his senpai. Tsuyoshi told him to stop calling him that. Shiki was stunned that his dad had once been a Momotaro. Samidare spoke again, saying Tsuyoshi knew better than anyone how dangerous the Oni were. Tsuyoshi stayed silent. Shiki was getting more and more annoyed, mostly because he had no idea what they were talking about. He was angry that his father had kept so many secrets, and his hair literally stood on end in frustration. Samidare then told Tsuyoshi that Shiki wasn't the only one marked for extermination. Tsuyoshi was also a target for hiding among the Oni. That set Tsuyoshi off. He shouted that Samidare wouldn't be killing anyone. But before he could even move, Samidare struck. In the next instant, Samidare was crouched off to the side, and Tsuyoshi, who had been ready to attack, was slashed across both shoulders. The wounds were deep and serious. Tsuyoshi doubled over and coughed up blood from the blow. Shiki yelled in panic when he saw his dad bleeding. Samidare asked Tsuyoshi if he really believed he could win after staying out of battle for so long. Furious, Shiki shouted at Samidare, asking if he wasn't the real target anyway. He demanded to be let go so he could kill him himself. Samidare smirked and said that was exactly what he planned to do next. But then, he suddenly glanced down in surprise. Tsuyoshi, even with those injuries, had crawled over and grabbed Samidare's leg. He refused to give up. Samidare asked why he'd go so far to protect an Oni. Tsuyoshi answered that even though his son was a reckless, rebellious idiot who loved fighting, none of that mattered. He was still his parent, and parents protect their kids no matter how much it hurts. He told Samidare not to underestimate parents, and if he wanted to know why, it was simple. Shiki was his son. Tsuyoshi looked fearless as he spoke to Samidare, even calling him a moron. Hearing his father say all that stirred something deep inside Shiki. Tsuyoshi kept talking, shifting the focus back to Samidare while tightening his grip on the cleaver, ready to strike again. He told Samidare exactly what kind of person he was, the kind who murdered innocent children just for being born with Oni blood, even when those kids had no idea about the war or any of the history behind it. Tsuyoshi then asked if someone like Samidare could even hold his own child the way he was protecting his. That hit a nerve. Samidare snapped and shouted, "Shut up!" As Shiki saw him getting ready to finish off his father, anger and despair twisted up inside him. He didn't understand why he was being forced to watch this, or why his dad had to suffer. He remembered how he'd told Tsuyoshi he didn't want to be like him, but the truth was, the one who couldn't do anything was him. His eyes locked on Samidare, and his thoughts raced. Why was this man trying so hard to kill him? Why did any of this have to happen? His frustration and fury boiled over. Samidare had injured his father, and now the only thought burning in Shiki's mind was that he wanted Samidare dead. It was like something took over him. Two horn-like shapes made of a dark reddish material burst from his forehead. His vision dimmed, and blood leaked from his eyes and nose while he screamed in his head that he would kill Samidare. At that moment, the web of black mist holding him shattered. In a blur, he closed the distance between them. His right hand transformed, and from each finger, the barrel of a .44 Magnum pointed straight at Samidare. Blood covered his arm and hand completely. Shiki pulled the triggers on all 5 guns at once, and the blast echoed through the warehouse. Tsuyoshi flinched at the sudden explosion and the cloud of smoke that followed. Samidare avoided being blown apart, but he was clearly stunned. He hadn't expected Shiki to awaken his power. Blood didn't just cover Shiki's arm anymore. His whole body was soaked in it. Samidare explained that Oni have a unique ability to fight by manipulating their blood, but that's not why people fear them. The true reason the Momotarou hunt Oni is because of their brutality and the way their minds deteriorate. Shiki's transformation grew even more extreme. Extra limbs formed from his own blood, and each one carried a different weapon. Everything from shotguns and M4s to pistols, revolvers, rocket launchers, an RPG, and even heavier artillery. He charged at Samidare, moving fast and leaving a wet trail of blood with every step. He delivered a fierce kick to Samidare's face, sending them both crashing into a wall. While Samidare lay in the rubble, Shiki stepped on his head and aimed a massive spread of weaponry directly at him. Samidare stared up at him, still not showing fear. From outside the warehouse, you could hear and feel the non-stop thunder of Shiki's weapons. But when the dust settled and we got a closer look, Samidare's body was gone. Blood dripped off of Shiki's form as it began pouring from the wounds across his body. A huge section of the warehouse had been destroyed in the chaos. Then we see Samidare walking in the distance, wounded but alive. The left side of his body was scorched, and his left arm was completely gone, but he was still moving. Samidare had no intention of backing down just because his opponent was an Oni. But suddenly, Shiki let out a loud pained groan that caught Samidare off guard. The blood wrapped around Shiki's body suddenly burst outward in every direction. What was left of it drained off him until only his arms and face were still smeared with red. Shiki looked completely lost. He stared at himself in confusion, shocked by the blood and the sharp claws that had formed on his hands and feet. He panicked at how terrifying he looked, and clearly had no memory of what he'd just done in his Oni form. Noticing Shiki's dazed state, Samidare realized he didn't remember the battle. He released black mist from the stump of his missing arm and shaped it into a cleaver. He charged at Shiki, planning to kill him while he was defenseless. He even said ending Shiki's life would fix the confusion he was feeling. Shiki was still on his knees, unready to fight or even defend himself, but at the last moment, Tsuyoshi stepped in. He threw himself between them and took the blow to his chest while landing a strike on Samidare's left side. Samidare's attack pierced straight through Tsuyoshi's heart, and Tsuyoshi's counterattack badly injured him in return. Both men were barely standing. Exhausted, Samidare looked at his senpai and asked if he still believed adopting Shiki had been the right move after seeing what the Oni boy was capable of. Tsuyoshi just smiled and said he had been glad to be a parent. Samidare closed his eyes, realizing he had killed the man he once respected most. Just then, a helicopter marked with the letters TV appeared overhead, and Samidare immediately noticed it. Samidare looked irritated when he saw the helicopter. It was a news chopper, which meant he couldn't stay there any longer. Shiki, still weak and shaking, tried to run toward him and yelled, "Wait!" But Samidare's body dissolved into black mist and started fading away. Shiki chased after him anyway and glared at him one last time before he disappeared completely. All Shiki could do was curse under his breath. He rushed back to his father, who was now coughing up blood. Shiki reached for his phone to call an ambulance, but Tsuyoshi stopped him. He said they should just talk. This would be their last conversation. Even in pain, he forced a smile for his son. Tsuyoshi apologized for keeping so many secrets. He knew Shiki was probably overwhelmed, but Shiki told him to forget about that. Tsuyoshi explained that he couldn't tell Shiki the truth about being an Oni because it would have put a target on his back. Telling a child something like that wasn't simple. Then Tsuyoshi held out his hand. He said that since he wouldn't be around anymore, Shiki had to be strong. He squeezed his son's hand hard to show he meant it and told him he needed the strength to never lose to any Momotaru or Oni. More than anything, he wanted Shiki to be strong enough to live a happy life. Then he asked Shiki to promise him, as a man. Shiki refused to accept it. He tried to lift his father up and shouted, "Shut up!" He didn't want to listen to any last words or watch his father give up. Shiki told his father that he wouldn't give up and said they still needed to talk about what came next. He asked if Tsuyoshi understood what he meant. Hearing that made Tsuyoshi remember when Shiki was just a baby reaching out for him to pick him up. That memory seemed to bring him peace, and he looked ready to die without regret. With his final words, Tsuyoshi said it would be nice if Oni and Momotaru could someday walk side by side, the way the two of them were now. Then, without warning, he collapsed. Shiki froze in shock, unable to accept it. He tried to shake his father awake, but the truth was clear. Tsuyoshi had died from his wounds. Shiki refused to believe it at first. Even though Tsuyoshi was lying in a pool of his own blood, he shouted that he still hadn't apologized for saying he was glad they weren't related. He cried that his father would have wanted to hear that and begged him to wake up. He even said he wanted to be yelled at by him again, but no matter what he said, there was no answer. Shiki's tears started falling, and soon he was sobbing uncontrollably. It was painful to watch him still clinging to hope. Eventually, he lowered his head and finally accepted that his father was gone. Just then, a voice spoke behind him, saying the scene was attracting too much attention. Shiki turned to look, but the man had already appeared in front of him with incredible speed. Before Shiki could react, the stranger shot a tranquilizer into his neck. The drug worked instantly. Shiki blacked out and collapsed, completely at the mercy of the man on rollerblades. The man suddenly pulled out a clipboard, revealing that he had actually been testing Shiki's abilities. Because he'd managed to get behind Shiki so easily, Shiki immediately lost points on what seemed to be some kind of entrance exam. The man then literally looked down at him and, in attitude too, he clearly thought Shiki wasn't even worth testing. While Shiki was still unconscious, he dreamed again about the moment his father died, the scene where Tsuyoshi took 2 deadly cuts across his shoulders. That memory was what pushed Shiki into his Oni transformation, turning his whole body blood red and monstrous. Seeing himself like that in the dream, Shiki was horrified. He suddenly jolted awake, only to realize there was a gag over his mouth again. He looked around and saw that his entire body was tied to a chair, hands, feet, everything. The chair sat in the middle of a huge empty room. Shiki had no clue how he ended up there. Nearby, the man in rollerblades was doing one-handed handstand push-ups, counting out loud. He reached number 1299 as he spoke. He told Shiki he hadn't woken him up earlier because he knew Shiki wouldn't understand anything right away, and he didn't want to explain things twice. He said he hated wasting time. After finishing his 1300th push-up, he stood upright. Shiki looked annoyed, confused, and a little uneasy. The rollerblade guy introduced himself as Naito Mudano and said that, like Shiki, he was also an Oni. You could tell he was telling the truth because he had 2 horns just like Shiki. Shiki was shocked to hear that Mudano was also an Oni. Before Shiki could even speak, Mudano cut him off and said he wasn't going to tell him where they were or where Tsuyoshi's body had been taken, so Shiki shouldn't bother asking. He said the only reason Shiki was here was for an exam and a gathering. Right after saying that, Mudano skated off and came back almost instantly, rolling a whiteboard on wheels. He casually mentioned that rollerblades were just more efficient since they let him move faster, and told Shiki not to waste time asking dumb questions. Shiki got irritated because he hadn't even asked anything yet. Mudano started drawing on the board, explaining the situation. The Momotaru Corporation's goal was still to wipe out every Oni, but here was the new part. For Shiki and for us, the Oni now had their own organized funded group too. They were preparing for war and were currently gathering useful people. Their job for now, Mudano said, was simple. Find newly awakened Oni like Shiki, test them, and decide if they were worth keeping. After finishing, Mudano zipped away with the board to return it, then came back and took the gag off Shiki's mouth. He said he was finally ready to hear questions, but Shiki didn't ask anything. He exploded with anger and demanded to be untied. He asked where his father was and warned that if they'd done anything to him, he would kill Mudano himself. Mudano just looked disappointed and deducted a point, saying, -1. Mudano reminded Shiki that he'd already said Tsuyoshi's body was being kept somewhere safe, and he wouldn't have used the word safe if they planned to harm it. Then he asked Shiki if he even had a brain, because that useless question had just wasted 35 seconds of his life. Shiki snapped back that he didn't care and didn't trust him anyway. Mudano replied that they weren't even talking about Shiki's father at the moment, and that Shiki was just making everything harder. So, if Shiki had no real questions, Mudano said he would move on with the exam. Shiki suddenly demanded to be untied, and Mudano docked him another 2 points. He explained that Shiki was restrained for a reason. He'd gone on a rampage earlier. Shiki told him to stop talking about points. Mudano asked if he had memory loss because he was acting like he forgot this was an exam. Furious, Shiki tried to break free and wondered what Mudano's problem was, but then he told himself to calm down, that this wasn't the time to lose control. He took a deep breath. More calmly, he said he didn't care about any exam and didn't have time for it. He politely asked Mudano to just let him go. He even forced a smile, though veins were bulging on his head, neck, and chest from anger. Shiki said he only wanted to avenge his father and begged Mudano not to get in his way, while secretly calling him a moron in his head. Mudano frowned and told Shiki to stop looking at him with such a disgusting expression. Shiki snapped back with a harsh, "What?" and Mudano took that as a sign that Shiki must have a death wish. Without warning, Mudano walked to the corner of the room where the whiteboard was. He hung up his umbrella, took off his necktie, and said he knew a method that worked well on people who wanted to die. He also mentioned he'd always thought their normal exams were inefficient. Then he approached Shiki with the necktie in hand and casually said it probably wouldn't suit Shiki anyway. Shiki had no idea what he was talking about and was about to ask, but before he could, Mudano looped the tie around his neck and began choking him. And that's exactly what he intended. As he strangled Shiki, Mudano explained that he just wanted to see if Shiki was actually useful or not. He pulled so hard that veins bulged across Shiki's face. Then he lifted him, chair and all, off the ground with the tie still cutting into his neck. Within seconds, Shiki's skin turned pale and his eyes rolled back. Mudano said that a creature's true nature comes out when it's close to death. He told Shiki to use whatever little brain he had to figure out an escape, because if he didn't, he'd die here for real. Shiki's face showed the panic and pain he was in. He understood he was being killed. No matter how wildly he kicked his legs, Mudano refused to let go. As Shiki struggled, he screamed in his mind that he refused to die like this. Blood tears began leaking from his eyes. His pupils rolled upward as his life started to fade. But in that moment, his fear flipped into raw determination. In his head, he swore he wouldn't die here. Then his body suddenly went still, and Mudano noticed it. He assumed Shiki had passed out, and muttered that he really was just a moron. But before he could finish the insult, blood began pouring from Shiki's hands and spreading across the floor. A sudden burst of blood exploded behind Mudano, shattering the chair Shiki had been tied to. Shiki transformed into his Oni state again, for the second time. Mudano didn't flinch. He just commented on how Shiki had gone berserk. Shiki pointed a massive machine gun made from his own blood straight at Mudano's face and opened fire. Smoke filled the room from the blast, but not a single bullet hit Mudano. He calmly deducted 100 points from Shiki's score. Blood splattered around Mudano like rain. He sighed and said he was disappointed, since it was obvious Shiki didn't even know how to use Oni blood correctly. So he decided he'd just show him. The blood dripping around him wasn't random. It was coming from his umbrella, which was actually formed from his own Oni blood. Mudano explained that this was the right way to use their power. He also noted that Shiki probably wouldn't remember any of this since he'd lost control.